just going to say one thing and then we'll start. I just want to mention, since Jacqueline is here, Jacqueline leads our Thursday night literature group, and I've heard a rumor that they're considering adding your book to the reading list.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know if you've decided, you could say something about it, but if not, just know that you're here.
I'll be happy to say something. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was very excited to learn about this book because every summer we do noir, and I wanted to do noir with a labor theme this year. So we're going, the proposed list is If He Hollers, Let Him Go by Chester Himes, which is about the LA migration of blacks to the labor industries. Then Walter Mosley's Red Death, and then which is also about 1950s FBI getting involved in the LA Communist Party. And then Attica Locke's Black Water, which is about the Black Panthers in Houston in 1981. So, and then we're going to finish up with this book. So I'm very, very excited about this. And I'm just hoping that everyone will be interested in attending our summer noir once we get it off the ground. But it will happen. It's just going to take a little bit of time. And thank you for offering this today and giving me such a wonderful opportunity to read a book by a author who's interested in our kind of stuff. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds like a great list. Okay, so we're going to start. I'm sure other people will join late. So welcome to everyone. I am joined with some technical difficulty by Lisa Nauer, who is driving in a car. Lisa is Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at UMass Dartmouth and deeply knowledgeable about and engaged in the politics, struggles, and community life of the immigrant communities who are featured in this book. And I was looking forward to Lisa saying more and asking some good questions from that point of view, and maybe she will be able to. And my own vantage point includes also Massachusetts focus, longtime activism, along with working on technology strategy. And also joining us today is Fred Murphy, and I'll just mention Fred is a frequent MEP convener and these days all around MEP rock star. Lisa, Fred, and I co-lead, along with one other person, the MEP's Capital Studies Reading Group, which takes place on Sunday afternoons. So I wanted to start with a few comments, and I'll say partway into Bill Fletcher's new book, newspaper journalist David Gomes, how should I say his name?
Gomes.
That's what I thought. And his boss, and I also can't pronounce her last name, Jacqueline Reynaud.
Yeah.
Are reviewing the progress that David has made on a new story. The story, like the book, centers on the death of an immigrant worker at the massive Quincy shipyard. And the story is not going anywhere fast. It's a complex story, and Jacqueline thinks not especially germane to what's on the minds of the paper's day-to-day readers. And there's lots else going on at the paper that Jacqueline wished David would help on. And so she comments to David, "You decided a long time ago that your mission in life was to follow through on a story to the end. I would not say that you are cavalier, but that you want to take risks in order to get a story. When I read that passage, and I had to read it a couple times, a light went on, because that's Bill Fletcher in a nutshell, following the story to an end and taking risks to do so. For as long as I've known Bill, which is to say a very long time, he has pursued the stories of our world and taken risks in when and how he shares those stories. Bill, you have written, spoken, taught, organized, advocated, researched, negotiated, and managed in so many contexts. When the rest of us might be focused on the immediate tactical choices in a campaign, Bill might have points about that, but also educate us all strategically by analogy. About what? A Black labor struggle in the early 20th century, the fate of Muslim populations under the Soviet Union, a random Star Trek episode, something Gramsci might have said during the Factory Council movement. And Bill would then bring all these into the micro situation of the moment. And now in this new book, a companion to Bill's earlier, The Man Who Fell to the Earth, Bill has taken many of his interests into the realm of fiction, and with great effect. The new novel takes on the immigrant experience, racism, labor unions and labor insurgency, the state of newspaper journalism, spies and infiltrators on the left, and none the least, the global impact of an armed right wing. And he has lives, personalities, job pressures, and love interests. Most impressive. And Lisa, I don't know if you wanted to add anything also by way of introduction, and then we'll call on Bill.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I want to make one small correction. It's not the same specific communities because I work in a different fraction of the same large, seafood industry. So the work that I have been doing since, I guess about the last 15 years, is with primarily Central American immigrant workers in New Bedford, Massachusetts, who flocked there after a strike that broke the unionized workplaces in seafood processing, which became the major industry in New Bedford after textile and whaling and other, which had been major local industries, went away for a variety of reasons. And have been, so I helped establish an immigrant workers center called Centro Comunitario de Trabajadores. We do have some Cape Verdean members, but the workforce, the super exploited, low wage, and largely undocumented labor force in the seafood processing industry is, and to a much lesser degree on the boats and on the docks, are Central Americans, primarily indigenous Guatemalans. And I actually just came from a meeting of a workplace justice campaign called Pescando Justicia, or Fishing for Justice, which was founded in the wake of a, I think, similarly horrific workplace accident in 2014 when a worker named Victor Herrera fell into a clam shucking machine at a company called Sea-Watch International in New Bedford. So I have not had a chance to read the book in its entirety. I'm really looking forward to that. So hopefully there won't be too many spoilers, and to engaging in this conversation. So welcome. And Bill has been a part of the project that the MEP is the kind of current incarnation of for many, many years. I know that we had hosted Bill long time back and many times since. So really great to see you again.
So the way these talks work, thank you, Lisa. The way these talks work is we will let Bill talk, read, whatever you'd like to do for as long as you want, and then we will have questions and answers. And I will defer to everybody here. I have lots of questions if things get quiet. But to lead us in, I wanted to read another short quote from the book. Also, David, the main character, speaking with Jacqueline, the newspaper's owner and manager. And she says, David, this may work as a crime drama on television, but I don't think this story is coming together, at least in the way you seem to think it is. And Bill, as I read this book, I wondered how this story, your story here, came together, and why a novel as opposed to yet another nonfiction book. And in recommending that the MEP invite Bill, I personally wanted to learn more about what drew you to choose this form and how you chose which themes to focus on and how you wove them into the story. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Lisa, members of the MEP, and each of you for doing this today. It's a real pleasure. So the Man Who Changed Colors is the sequel to The Man Who Fell from the Sky. What runs through both of them, and it's The Man Who Changed Colors is not a book that you have to have read. No, you don't have to have read the first book in order to read the second. And that's a philosophical choice on my part. That is, I get really irritated when I come across books where you have to have read, the first or second book in order to understand the third. I like self-contained stories, even when they're building me off of other stories. So that's what I did. I wrote The Man Who Changed Colors as in some ways a way of tying together some loose ends from the first book. So you can read the second one and then choose to read the first, and it won't be particularly odd. Let me take your question, Steve, in two parts. So how I got to write fiction, I want to start with the basic story of The Man Who Changed Colors. Begins in 2004 with the discovery of some bones. And then it goes back to 1978 in the Quincy, Massachusetts shipyard, the summer of 78. And a Cape Verdean welder falls to his death. Now, I situate this a week after I had fallen 20 feet at the same Quincy shipyard, which was actually true. And about 2 weeks after someone fell 9 feet and died. And so part of my writing this was thinking about that whole experience, how close to death I actually was. I mean, very close. Had I not been knocked unconscious immediately in falling back, I would have died. There's no question about it. And so the main character is a guy named David Gomes, who's a Cape Verdean American journalist out of Hyannis, Massachusetts, with a small paper. And he is asked to write a story about why shipyards were at that time at least the second most dangerous industry in the country. And so in investigating and doing the research for this, he slowly begins to suspect that this was not an accident. And he also can't figure out if it wasn't an accident, then why? What would have motivated this? So those are the basic outlines, and we can talk some more about it. One of the things that runs through both, Steve, is my obsession with race, justice, and revenge. So with regard to race, I wanted to write in both cases a story that steps a little bit out of the traditional US approach to race, which is black versus white, and black being defined as people who were the descendants of slaves largely in the South. And maybe, if you're being generous, Caribbeans. And all of these other peoples of color become secondary to that story. So what I wanted to do was to flip that, to really introduce the complexity of racism and to show how an African population, the first post-1492 African population to come to the United States voluntarily, how their experience under Portuguese colonialism and the Portuguese form of white supremacy was different from ours. Not better, not worse, it was just different. And that when you look at that, that helps to broaden one's approach to understanding racism, that is not a binary, that there are certain things that are in common and certain things that are different with different groups that we would call people of color, but it's really important to understand the particularities. So I wanted to do that through fiction. I mean, I've written nonfiction on this, but I wanted to do it through fiction. I also wanted to get at highlighting this population, Cape Verdeans. And one of the things that has been really striking for me, because I grew up interacting with Cape Verdeans when my family would vacation on Cape Cod, and as I always like to say, I met these Black people with strange names. And I was a New Yorker, right? So I was used to Spanish names and Italian names, Polish names, Jewish, you name it, right? Chinese. But I came across these Black folks that didn't speak with a Spanish accent. They spoke with a certain kind of accent, but not exactly. And they had these different names. And it sounded almost Spanish, but they weren't. And they didn't always identify as Black, even if they were dark as coal. So you could see my complexion, and it's like I grew up understanding that I was Black. I mean, it was called Negro when I was born, colored, but I knew what I was. There was no ambiguity. And then I'd meet people who were as dark as coal, who were a little bit, they would be doing a Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers on the whole question of what exactly they were. And it was like, what exactly is going on here? So over time, I started to learn about Cape Verdeans. And then as I became radicalized, I learned about Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the revolution against the Portuguese in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde Islands, who was himself Cape Verdean. And then when I got to Massachusetts, I became deluged with information, and it was fascinating, and I'm still fascinated. When I go to other parts of the United States, I'll say something about Cape Verdeans, and it's a blank look. I mean, if I was talking about Romulans, people it would resonate more than talking about Cape Verdeans. And that led me to say, well, we got to do something about this. Now, some people have said to me, well, why didn't you just write a nonfiction book on Cape Verdeans? I said, well, there's two reasons. One is that probably no one would read it. And the second is I'm not an expert on Cape Verdeans. I didn't get a doctorate in that. And so I found fiction to be a great vehicle to interest people. So people can take it and run with it, which, I know people have. Now, justice and revenge is something that I've always been very curious about. The line. Where is the line? At what point is someone exercising extrajudicial justice versus revenge? At what point do you rely on the judicial system to exercise justice? And what do we actually mean by justice? So in both books, I'm dealing with that in very different ways. In The Man Who Fell from the Sky, it takes you back to an incident that takes place in World War II, an incident that I borrowed from something that I read eons ago, and used that. I'd always wanted to figure out a way to use that incident, and I figured it out. In The Men Who Change Colors, I wanted to write something about the post-Portuguese Revolution, the post-Guinea-Bissau Cape Verde independence period, and what it meant on multiple levels. And so that's what I did. And let me just say one other thing about writing fiction. I grew up envisioning stories. And I felt when I became radicalized when I was like 15, well, that's when I started joining organizations, when I was 13. But I thought that writing fiction was sort of frivolous, that it wasn't something that a good radical should be doing. There was so many other important things to be writing about. And so I'd come up with stories in my head, but never do it. After I wrote Solidarity Divided back in 2008 about the crisis in the labor movement, I decided to take a break and write a manuscript of fiction. And it was a murder mystery, and it did not get published. I went to an agent, however, to ask her whether she would read it and give me some ideas. So she read it, and a few weeks later, she got back in touch with me, told me she didn't like it at all. And then her final words, I mean, she was completely unhelpful. Her final words to me were, "When you return to writing nonfiction, call me." And I said, wow. And had I not enjoyed writing it so much, I would have been absolutely crushed. And it was one of those real teachable moments. You know, it's like it reminds people, educators particularly, but not just educators, you have to be very careful with your words. I mean, if you want to crush somebody, there are many ways to do it. If you want to encourage someone forward, then you've got to be very careful about your words. So I eventually got back to the idea of writing work of nonfiction. So I came up with a story, and I was on vacation with my wife and daughter, and I told them the story. And my daughter was looking at the floor, and then she looked up at me and she said, "Dad, I think you have a story there, and maybe even two." And then I looked over at Candace, and she smiled and nodded and said, "Yeah." And then I wrote it.
Very cool. Were you thinking you might read a bit?
Sure. Let me read from the beginning, almost the beginning. And let me just say that I was lucky to get a publisher. I couldn't find an agent. Every agent I approached turned me down, including one who told me that she liked the manuscript. This is the second The Man Who Fell from the Sky. She told me she liked the manuscript, would have introduced the characters differently than I did, and therefore was not going to represent me. And I had to read that like 3 times because I said, she says she liked the manuscript. She has some editing suggestions and won't represent me. And I was almost despairing, and then I bumped into my publisher. And he's a small publisher out in New York, Hardball Press, and he decided to take it on. And in taking it on, he basically taught me to write fiction. We went through about 12 drafts. And I first gave it to about 5 people, including my wife and daughter, and then 3 friends who gave me the thumbs up. But Tim really edited it and forced me to think about how to convey things, which is so different than writing nonfiction. So with that, let me start here. July 1978, Quincy, Massachusetts, the Quincy shipyard. Alberto Pires returned to his position on the starboard side of the liquefied natural gas tanker under construction. Already covered in sweat, he had just taken his 9 a.m. break. It was one of those Massachusetts summer days where the heat and humidity were off the charts, even this early in the morning. Like most welders in the shipyard, Pires had gotten used to the heat and humidity, hated it, but gotten used to it. Pires climbed through the partially completed hatch to enter the compartment where he and his partner, Alice Love, had been working. Looking around, he realized that he was alone, Alice gone on break. Slowly, he climbed up the ladder 15 feet to get to his position on the wooden planks resting on metal stiffeners. He sat on the upturned can he used while welding or when taking a break. Pires took a quick look at Alice's position and the can on which she had been sitting. Her electric arc welding line, holder, and shield were lying next to her can. Damn, he hated working with women, even women as gorgeous as Alice. The shipyard was no place for them, and he could not believe, at least until he met Alice, that women could make good welders. But sure enough, she was not just good, she was great. Even with half the men in the shipyard hitting on her, she ignored them and kept working. Maybe she was uma lesbica. He did not know. Pires felt his undershirt clinging to his soaked body. He hated this work, but at least he had a job. When Pires arrived in Massachusetts from Portugal, the welding job was the only work he could find. It did not help to remember that once he had been a big man, an important man. But wasn't that the story for so many immigrants? Pires pulled his mask over his mouth and nose, making sure to cover his mustache and short beard to protect him from the fumes and dirt. He refitted the earplugs, muffling the sounds around him, and donned his helmet. The hammering and drilling had picked up in tempo as more of the workers turned from morning break. The smell from the welding wasn't too bad in his compartment because there were only 2 of them, and there was a blower making a sound like a persistent moaning, constantly pushing the smoke out of the hole. He stood up, attached the welding rod to the holder, and locked it into position, then pulled his shield down, closing the visor and looking through the darkened lens. In the darkness, he struck the arc, watching it glowing golden, creating what looked like lava. The lava turned into a welding bead, which he lay horizontally across the top of the compartment. He heard a noise below, not stopping the check, but assuming that Alice was returning to her position. He felt the vibration of someone climbing the ladder, and then heard someone, probably Alice, climbing up to their position. He kept welding, focused on the bead and the golden molten metal being put into place. With the welding rod burned down to about an inch, Pires stopped, lifted his shield, and disconnected the remnant of the rod from the holder, throwing the remnant down. He turned around, expecting to see Alice, but there was no one there. Curious, Pires, standing nearly 6 feet tall, rose and walked over to the ladder situated against the planks. He leaned over to take a look, but lost his balance and fell forward. Suddenly, everything went dark. There's another piece that I'd like to read. I had fun writing this piece. So I'm not going to give away too much, but you get the idea that Gomes is led to believe by someone from MASCOSH, the Massachusetts Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, that this was an industrial accident. And everybody believed it was. But Gomes is concluding not so fast. So he ends up talking to some people at the shipyard, and there's a rank and file caucus that has been dealing with occupational safety and health issues. And actually, at our Quincy shipyard, there was a rank and file caucus. And they put him in touch with this Irish immigrant who had moved here and was working at the Quincy shipyard. And he's a leftist. And he lives in Dorchester, and he is basically asked by David to try to find out whether this particular racist organization that exists could possibly have whacked this Cape Verdean immigrant. So the chapter begins as follows.
What page?
Page 108. The Green Derby was located just north of Fields Corner on Dorchester Avenue in the Dorchester section of Boston. It was a regular watering hole for a local clientele from the white section of Dorchester. There were 2 pool tables towards the back, along with a bar and tables where patrons could eat and drink. Plaques and pictures from Ireland were set along the wooden walls of the establishment. With little outside light coming through high windows, the Green Derby had this strange appearance. The large room bathed in artificial light had the atmosphere of a Vegas casino where you lose any sense of time. By 6:30 p.m. it was busy and generally remained so till closing. Jimmy Scanlon and Jackie Nellis came walking in around 7:30 p.m., loud and joking as ever, and headed over to the bar to order a couple of beers. Both married, they spent as little time at home as they could, leaving their spouses to take care of the kids. Their philosophy was simple. They brought home the bacon, their wives cooked it. The bacon came from working construction or in the Quincy shipyard. They were sometimes called fat and skinny because Scanlon had a hell of a beer belly and Nellis was as thin as a weed, reminding you of the old Laurel and Hardy comedy team. They went everywhere together, including into periodic fights that they seemed to love. Nellis looked around the bar and saw Eddie O'Hare at one of the pool tables shooting pool by himself. Nellis and Scanlon picked up their beers, walked over to the table, and pulled up a couple of stools. They sat for a moment watching O'Hare concentrate on his next shot. Crack! O'Hare's targeted ball went right into the pocket. No surprise, O'Hare was a brilliant player. He regularly won and in fact always seemed to win when he played for money, which he did only on rare occasions. He relaxed when he shot pool by himself, testing various shots, pushing himself again and again. Good evening, boys, O'Hare said as he walked around the table strategizing his next shot. Thanks for joining. You said it was important, eh? Scanlon said, watching the master at his work. O'Hare glanced over at the two of them, but refocused on the balls on the table. Something come to my attention, he said, lowering his voice. You know that Cape Verdean guy that got killed in the shipyard back in July? Crack! O'Hare carried out a combination shot to the side pocket. Yeah, I remember when the nigger got killed. Dumb fuck probably wasn't paying attention, said Nellis, smiling as if he was describing a circus act gone bad. Crack! The 6-ball went into the corner pocket, seemingly at the speed of light. I've told you, cut that nigger shit, unless you want me to put the stick up your ass, O'Hare said, without once looking at Nellis, who turned red and repositioned himself on his stool as if to burrow in. Anyway, what's the emergency, Eddie? Scanlon asked, trying to change the subject and the feel of the moment. Crack! Another bank shot into the other side pocket. O'Hare walked around the table. Well, boys, the word on the street, or maybe I should say the word in the yard, is that it wasn't an accident at all, but it was murder, and your little outfit was behind the killing. I just thought that you should know, that's all. Out of the corner of his eyes, O'Hare saw Scanlon and Nellis freeze as he lined up another shot. What the fuck you talking about, Eddie? Replied Nellis, his eyes twitching from nerves, with Scanlon starting to say the same thing at the same time. Just what I said. The symbol from your club was found at the site where the guy was killed. There's some thinking that the guy was murdered. Where the hell do you hear that, Eddie? Scanlon almost yelled, some of the nearby customers turning to look at him. Crack! O'Hare knocked the 5-ball into the corner pocket and then turned to face Fat and Skinny. You don't need to know that, boys. What you do need to know is that if your group of happy soldiers was behind this, you're probably going to have a hell to pay. Not because I'm going to snitch on you. He returned to focusing on the table. Scanlon and Nellis looked at each other. Without saying another word, Nellis took off and went to a payphone near the restrooms. O'Hare walked around the table exploring different potential shots. Crack! Scanlon shook at the sound and looked around nervously as he watched for his buddy to return. Nellis came running back. Nah, Eddie, it wasn't us. I knew that it wasn't, but I just needed to make sure that no one went rogue. But nah, we're not looking for any trouble with that black social club in the shipyard or with anyone else, said Nellis, a line of perspiration running down his face. These stupid amateurs, thought O'Hare. I lay this shit out and they go make a call in the same location where the three of us are meeting. If they had brains, they'd be dangerous. But listen, Eddie, one of our friends in the society wants to talk with you about this so that we can, get to the bottom of what's happening and who's trying to set us up. So it shouldn't take a long time. If just come with us. O'Hare faced the two of them and held his cue stick, applying chalk to the tip. His eyes went back and forth between the stick and the two gentlemen standing in front of him. If you boys think I'm going anywhere with you this evening, you've lost your minds. And if you think I can be taken against my will, you underestimate my friends. You wouldn't think that I'd come to this meeting with you two guys unprepared, would you? Scanlon and Nellis looked around the room, peering at different faces. There was no way to tell whether O'Hare was pulling their legs or whether he had friends in the club. I'm telling you this shit because it's a warning. I don't like your group and I don't like your ideas. I don't like the way that you play with fire and bully people. But I think that you're being played right now and I don't know why. So, boys, we're just going to leave it at that, aren't we? He blew on the tip of the cue stick while eyeing the two men. Yeah, Eddie, no problem. We'll explain it. Maybe sometime we can all meet, have a beer and clear this up, but we get it, Nellis said with a shiver in his voice. O'Hare nodded his head and turned his back on Fat and Skinny. Crack! 8-ball in the corner pocket. O'Hare smiled, as did several others watching the master work, while Fat and Skinny hurried away.
So I'm going to open this up in a second. I wanted to say that I loved this chapter on a lot of levels. The drama was great, and just your portrayal of these characters, these white characters, as so many other people in the book, just seemed really very well done. And it didn't hurt to be able to picture one likely bar that you were talking about.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that I was going to ask some things when it got around to me, but I realized they might spoil the ending. But even in this chapter, there's this hint of violence which hangs over the book. And you mentioned being interested, you said a couple times, the fine line between revenge and justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I, either now or before we finish, I hope you'll say more about that and how maybe the contemporary context filtered into your thinking about what they emphasized in the book. Because I found that great, but also, I admit, a bit unexpected. So,
well, let me just say something about that, because then I really, I'm really interested in what everyone's thinking. In the early 2000s, I went to Robben Island in South Africa, off the coast of Cape Town, where Nelson Mandela and many others had been imprisoned. And the tour was led by a white South African who had been a guard and had flipped on apartheid. And a friend of mine from Cape Town took me on this trip. I had been reluctant to go. This wasn't my first trip to South Africa. I've been reluctant to go to Robben Island because I didn't know, I'm a very emotional person. I did not know how I was going to respond. And after the trip, I said to my friend, I'm amazed that you didn't put all of these apartheid people up against a wall and annihilated them. And I realized, there's this very deep anger that exists within me that every so often comes out. It's not just political anger, it's something else as well. I'm not sure. It came out a few years ago when someone held my daughter up at gunpoint. And my attitude was I wouldn't have cried if a cop had put a bullet in the guy's head. I mean, that may not be the politically correct thing to say, but I wouldn't have given a shit. Because you pull a gun on an unarmed civilian, you get what you get. And so I've been trying to process this, Steve. You know, this justice and revenge stuff. And one of the conclusions I've come to is that truth and reconciliation are insufficient. That there's another R that's missing. And that's rectification. So that, in other words, it needs to be TRR, truth, rectification, and reconciliation. You can't jump from truth to reconciliation. Because if there is no proof that a practice or that there's an effort to rectify a crime, then it's all words. It can be emotional words, but it's all words. And so for me, issue then becomes when you're thinking about justice, it's got to be TRR. That this notion that some people have that apologies, even deeply felt apologies, are enough, whether they're from Nazis or whether they're from Hutu war criminals or whether they're from a criminal on Washington Street, right? It doesn't really matter. Apologies are insufficient. Something else is necessary. And that something else is more than just punishment. So the characters in both of my books are grappling with just that question. And it's not that I've answered the question. I want the reader to grapple with that question with me.
Good answer. Interesting. So I just want to mention to everybody, including the couple people here who maybe this is your first MEP event, the MEP Marxist Education Project, in different names and forms, has been having classes and events for 45 years now. And right now, everything is online since the pandemic started. We have classes, reading groups, and author talks every week. And I'll just say that oftentimes people register for multiple things. Our prices are low, and then they don't come because they've signed up for too many things. And that may be what happened today. We do record. The reason why I wanted to interrupt now is we do record. We record everything. Generally, the recordings are only shared with people who registered and couldn't make it, or the people who are here, or with people who are subscribers, season ticket holders, pass holders, whatever you want to call them. But in general, people who could have come even without registering. So I hope with that, if you have questions, you feel okay asking them. And if you, and you can always just put your thoughts in chat as opposed to reading them. So who has some questions or comments or reactions?
This is Jacqueline. May I say something?
Of course.
Oh, thank you. This is on the comment that Mr. Fletcher made about questioning the value of novels. And before I came, the reason why I was late for this event is I just spent 2 hours in the New York Public Library reading essays on Tom McGrath, who is a neglected American poet who was also a Marxist, who really dealt with this question about the power of the imagination to keep us going in hope and to thinking about the possibilities of the world we want. So I would emphasize how important it is for Marxists to not neglect creative endeavors, and that novels like this are intensely important for bringing up questions and introducing people who might not come to a political event, because we have to be more than just wrote a pamphlet, right? We have to give people a world to, an alternative world, alternative thoughts. And efforts like this novel are so important to that. So I really want to say that writing, even a mystery novel, which is considered very light, right? It is an alternative way of looking. No, I'm sorry, people think of genre fiction as not as important as literary fiction, and I love genres. But let's not dismiss our desires for a bigger world, and that we've learned that through creative efforts. Just wanted to point that out.
Let me reply to part of that, and then I see that Fernando Herrero has a question in the chat. So I absolutely agree with you, but there's a strange reality in the left. And that is, fiction is frequently viewed as a secondary realm, although most leftists I know are real fiction buffs, science fiction, whatever, right? But they don't really see it. They see it almost as the equivalent of I don't know, just taking a ride, in the neighborhood or something to relax. And so, for instance, in both of my books, I went to left publications, and I'll name them, Jacobin and In These Times, and I asked them to write a review, and both of them refused. So Jacobin said, we don't review fiction. And I said, you got to be kidding. When you look at the leftists who have written fiction, whether it's Dashiell Hammett, Octavia Butler, Walter Mosley, Kim Stanley Robinson, the list goes on and on. How can you not review fiction? They refuse to respond. Literally, that was it. In These Times, the person I was in touch with told me that this was in 2019, said that the higher-ups don't review fiction, don't do fiction. And I made the same argument, and she said, yeah, I understand. I get it. It's just that the higher-ups won't go for it. So when my second book came out, second novel, I went back to both of those publications, and Jacobin is holding the line. We don't do fiction. In These Times, they have a new publisher. We don't know what's going to happen. So there's a problem. And I think that problem will only change when readers start saying to these publications, you got to cut this shit out. You just do. You've got to pay attention to this. The fight in the cultural realm is essential. So we'll see. we'll see what happens. To your question, Fernando, fiction gives me the opportunity to dream. It gives me the opportunity to play out issues that I'm grappling with. It gives me the opportunity to obviously tell a story, and I like telling stories. And one of the things that I've realized, because I do a lot of public speaking, is that when I tell stories in my speeches, whether through making references to movies, TV shows, books, or whatever, I always get a certain kind of positive feedback of people saying how much they appreciated that and how that reference put things together. And so writing a book of fiction, therefore, was not a huge jump because there were these two stories I wanted to tell. And fiction was just a really good way of doing it. I'm not familiar with Pedro Costa, so I can't answer that part of your question.
Who else?
There's the question in the chat from Fernando.
No, that's what I answered.
That's what you just answered.
Yeah, that's what I just answered.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, can I say something, Steve?
Yep.
It's not just a question of fiction. It's also just a question of popular writing and speaking. I think you're talking about that too, Bill.
That's right.
If it's a political thing that you're writing, especially if you're doing it for people in your workplace, the writing has to be popular, which includes popular references. So I think that you're absolutely right, Bill. That's great. I wonder too whether there's a unique history of the U.S. public and its relationship to reading fiction over many years. I'm thinking like in some countries, for example, Russia before the revolution, people read novels knowing that they were fiction, but that there were hidden political meanings because of censorship. That was the only way you could talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's been so true in the U.S. So people have that division between this is just for fun, as you were mentioning. This is just like watching some stupid TV show, as opposed to finding that the questions and grappling with the questions that are being asked in a work of fiction.
I think that's right. I think that there's another factor also, Meju, which is people don't expect me to write fiction. Let me ask you all this: how many of you know that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a novel? Okay.
I knew.
Okay, so we got two people. Most people don't know that he wrote a novel, apparently a good one. But we don't think about him as a novelist. Some people may recognize that he was a poet, but most people don't think of him as a novelist. And one of the problems that I think that I face on this is that people don't think of me writing fiction. They think of me as a nonfiction writer. So in my first book, the response that I got from many people when I told them that I was writing fiction ended up being very similar to when I told people I was organizing minor league baseball players, which was, why are you doing that? It's like, is this just like for fun? I mean, it's like, it couldn't possibly be of any importance. And that becomes a problem because we get typecast. And I also think that fiction writers get typecast. So Walter Mosley is known for writing great fiction. He also writes nonfiction, but he's not known for writing nonfiction. People don't think of him when they're thinking nonfiction. And so the lack of like a dialectical approach on this stuff, I think really becomes a problem for those of us that are trying to be multidimensional. and this is a real challenge. I mean, I've had both books have got really, really good responses, but it's been really hard getting reviews. Really hard. It's like, I'll give you an example. The Cape Cod Times is obviously located in Cape Cod. And by coincidence, so are both of my books. So I don't think you have to be an Einstein to come to the conclusion that it might be of interest to the Cape Cod Times to write a review about two books that take place in Cape Cod that deal with a population that's been there since the mid 1800s. Nope, nothing. I mean, when I explored this, they said, "Well, are you from the Cape?" I mean, it's like, what does that have to do with the price of eggs on Sunday? I said, no. I said, but I would vacation almost every year with my family on the Cape, and I continue to go to the Cape, and it's like a second home. But that wasn't enough. So I feel like there's a political struggle that has to be waged, both about getting readers to understand that as humans we're multidimensional, and that we don't need to be locked into something, but also there needs to be a fight with media outlets, and we need to push them. I mean, I want people to, write to Jacobin and say, why aren't you writing a review of this damn book? Why aren't you doing fiction? Don't tell us that, we don't have anybody can do it. There's plenty of people that can do it.
Lisa wanted to speak. Thank you. Good comment and a good spur to all.
Yeah. What I wanted to address doesn't really have to do with fiction per se. So if there are other people who want to sort of continue along this line, maybe they should go and I can hold off, because I really wanted to get back to the question of race in a more general way. Is that okay to do that at this point? Or do people want to continue the discussion about publishing and fiction?
Take it away.
Okay. So something that I found really interesting in your comments, and also, what I know from having done some interviews with people in the Cape Verdean community in New Bedford and people who, came of age during the 1960s and the 1970s, so U.S.-born Cape Verdeans, who started to see themselves as Black and identified with the Black Power movement, and their parents, some of whom were U.S.-born and some of whom had been immigrants from the islands who were still at this time, colonial possessions of Portugal, identified as Portuguese. So to just take a step back from that particularities, and I think that that's changed at least, in the 50 or 60 years since then, with younger, both Cape Verdeans and Cape Verdean Americans who identify as, and in my school, which is UMass Dartmouth, we have students who are both Cape Verdean American and students who are immigrants or recent immigrants from the islands, who identify to a large degree as African or African American and Black within that spectrum. But I think, sort of an interesting question or an interesting issue, which is how immigrants coming from countries, and I think that the concept of Omi and Wynand about racial formation is really useful here, who come from countries where there is particular, constellation of racial and ethnic identities, and who know who they are, and come to the United States and then try to figure out where they fit into a very different racial formation or racial constellation. And clearly, in the kind of panoply of characters that are in your book, which are from many, many different immigrant groups, which we see, in Massachusetts, in many different parts of the state, kind of vying, and some farther along in that process of assimilation into a racial category in the United States and others at different stages. And just wanted to just offer, so that's just sort of an observation, and just one other very brief comment about that, is to kind of illustrate that from the community that I work with, which is, as I said earlier, largely Central American immigrants, many of whom are indigenous people from Guatemala, who don't really quite fit into the categories here, right? Who resist to some degree being classified as Latino or Hispanic because the Spanish were the conquerors and the oppressors, and they're still, racially discriminated for being indigenous, both in Guatemala and by non-indigenous Guatemalans and other non-indigenous Latinos in the United States. So it's just, I think, an interesting question, and how that gets played out, to kind of bring it back more directly, to the subject that you're addressing, how that gets played out in terms of alliances and workplace politics and labor organizing. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts about that, both in terms of, excuse me, how you address that in your books, but also how you have addressed that in your long career as a labor organizer. And
Well, there's a number of issues in what you're raising, Lisa, that I want to start with the historical issue first, and then I may need you to remind me of the rest of it. Because part of what I was trying to pique the interest of people, the reader, in a different form of white supremacy that exists in the rest of the Western Hemisphere and existed on Cape Verde. What many people don't appreciate is that the Spanish and the Portuguese came to the Western Hemisphere in a very different way and had a different impact than did the English. And a large part of that had to do with the lack of capitalist development within Portugal and Spain. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish come to the Western Hemisphere and they invade to rape, to grab gold and silver and other things to bring it back to Europe and enrich the monarchies. And interestingly, those monarchies often sent their money to banks in the Netherlands. The English, however, being further down the road of development of capitalism, were dealing with displaced populations and that had been moved off of the land. And they were being resettled. And they were being settled in Ireland first, and then later in the Western Hemisphere. The English had, the Spanish and the Portuguese, because of the relatively few or low percentage of Europeans that were actually coming, it wasn't like mass migrations from Spain and Portugal. They end up mixing with the Indians, the indigenous, and with the Africans who end up being brought in as slaves. And they developed what the Spanish came to call las castas, the castes. And the Portuguese had their own version of that, that was very much based on skin color. English did not in North America. English come when they can't work things out with the indigenous the way they want. They start this annihilation. They start bringing in populations of settlers. They start pushing the indigenous back. They weren't interested in intermixing, and they weren't interested in creating a mestizo population, what we would call a mestizo population. And so you have a different way that white supremacy played out. In both cases, it's very useful in terms of divide and conquer and social control, but it has different premises. So the Cape Verdeans, who were populations that got brought to the Cape Verde Islands it was deserted when the Portuguese got there. They bring these Africans from the mainland, and Cape Verde becomes a transit point of the slave trade to the Western Hemisphere. And there are also population mixtures that start happening on the Cape Verde archipelago. And some of those mixtures differ from island to island. And where you might have certain islands where people are darker and others where there's been much more intermixing. And these shades become very, very important in terms of identity and social control. Very important. And this becomes very important in Las Castas, which a lot of folks in the United States that are unfamiliar with Latin America don't get. So they don't get how Afro-Latinos, what we would call Afro-Latinos, can come to the United States, be very dark, but distance themselves from any reference to being black. And that is much of what you would see within the Cape Verdean population. And because it was a different form of white supremacy, it played itself out differently for different reasons. And so therefore, for Cape Verdeans coming to the United States beginning in the 19th century, they encounter an African population that had a very different history, a history that was rooted overwhelmingly in slavery, was Protestant, religious-wise, English-speaking, compared to the Cape Verdeans who were not slaves, who came voluntarily as fishermen, whalers, and their families spoke Portuguese or Criollo, were Catholic. And these populations did not always mix, but they did mix. And so the Cape Verdean population over time played a major role in reshaping Black America. And so you get people, cultural figures like Horace Silver, the great jazz pianist who did Song for My Father. It's Cape Verdean, right? And for years I had no idea. I mean, particularly because it spelled his name Silver. But I had no idea of this. And you had other folks, the founder of the NAACP on the Cape, was a Cape Verdean woman. Daddy Grace, exactly. Another example. And so there are all these figures that become part of Black America, and then they don't necessarily continue to identify as Cape Verdean. Sometimes they did. And then you have other populations, or segments of the Cape Verdean population that explicitly did not identify as Black. So one of the things that I was mentioning before we got started, 1984, when I was working with the Jesse Jackson presidential campaign on the labor side, I found out that there was this local union of dock workers in New Bedford that was Black. That is what was told to me. Bill, there's a Black local of the ILA. So I said, great, right? So I reached out to them to get them to join the Jackson campaign. I don't remember them doing it. But anyway, but then when I started writing something that came to be known as the Indispensable Ally, I decided I wanted to understand that experience. So I set up a meeting through the business manager, and he brought in these retirees who had been active in the 30s and 40s. And these older guys, all very well dressed. I was probably the lightest person in the room, a real rainbow of colors. And they come in and sit down. And I started asking them questions about what it was like to work there. So then at a certain point, I said, well, did you have any problems with the white guys? And they got silent. They looked at each other as if I was just speaking Aramaic. And that was the language that Jesus spoke. And it was just like looking, like they had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, with the white guys. They just kind of shrugged their shoulders and no. And then one guy said, something with the Greenwood boys, but that was no problem. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And I said, this just doesn't make any sense. I know enough about history to know this doesn't make any sense. So several months later, by coincidence, I met a guy named Jack Custodio, who was a longtime Cape Verdean American activist, a progressive. Everybody knew him. And I was at a meeting and I told him about this thing. And Jack broke into this laugh, this deep laugh. And he said, Bill, the Greenwood boys were the Portuguese. They meaning the guys I was speaking to, did not want to acknowledge that they themselves weren't Portuguese and weren't white. I said, wow, it's that deep. I said, yeah, it's that deep. Now the conditions, I've been out of Massachusetts for a long time, but I know well enough, it's very different. My first book takes place around 1970, 71, and there's this real transition in thinking that's going on among Cape Verdeans, influenced by both the independence struggle against the Portuguese, but also the Black Power movement in the United States. And then the second book takes place in 78 and 79, and that's also influenced by great changes, which then, Lisa, goes to your question about how have I dealt with this. One of the things that my experiences have taught me is the importance of history, and the importance of history in discussing uniting the working class. That it's not about diversity trainings. It's not about getting people to like each other. That can be an option, an outcome, but that's not the main thing. If you don't understand history, and particularly the relationship between the construction of racism and the development of capitalism, nothing succeeds. It just doesn't go anywhere. I was talking with some union leaders recently about how to confront the far right. And a number of them fell back into the same old that we've heard for years. Let's unite around economics. Let's unite around good economic structural reforms that bring everybody together. And, the militant economic struggle. And I pointed out to them that in the 2 years prior to the victory of fascism in Italy and Germany, the trade union movement had become really militant around economic issues and completely ignored the danger of fascism. And we see where that got us. Well, the broader thing is we see where it gets us when we ignore race. So I really put an emphasis on connecting the development of historical understanding about race with what we have to do programmatically. And that really means targeting the leaders among the workers so that they get a broader analysis. And I'm hoping that in the realm of fiction, my books have, inspired some interest in pursuing that.
Good comments. I'm going to mention something. Let me just make sure nobody's waiting. I'm going to mention something which partly goes with what we've been talking about, which is kind of different and unique forms of white supremacy. And it's going to allow me to bring up another topic. And I wonder if you, Bill, or anybody else has read the novels of Celeste Ng, particularly her latest one. So she's written 3 novels about the Chinese immigrant experience in the U.S. And the first one actually was a murder mystery, or in part a murder mystery. I don't remember it too well, but her most recent book, also just out this year, Our Missing Hearts, is very contemporary, and it takes place in a U.S. where books are being removed from libraries, and increasing repression in general, but particularly against people who do or can be presumed to come from Chinese background. And if you take the 3 books together, they put together a picture of the Chinese immigrant experience, both in how it differs from other people's, but also with a lot of eerie parallels about people who are marginalized and dispossessed. And when I've read her books, I've wondered about just this issue, like how much to read it as uniquely about Chinese immigration and how much to read it about as some universals. The thing that's interesting about the most recent book is that, the main character, first of all, 3 things. First of all, her books, I realized as I was thinking about this, her books have the impact of these developments on children, which you haven't quite, youth characters, which you haven't quite attempted yet, it seems. That's the secondary thing. In this most recent book, the main character decides to take action, and it's not per se violent action, so it's different than your book, your most recent book, but it's definitely insurgent, let's just say. And then the third thing is that as it appears, it has elements of science fiction in it, without saying anything more, which leads me to ask, knowing something of your interest, which you've already alluded to today, like, do you see something coming, without presuming you are going to write a 3rd novel, do you see something coming at some point which dips into the realm of science fiction? And also, I didn't see you or anybody nodding about Celeste Ng's book, but I do recommend reading it.
Cool. No, I haven't read her. I frequently like to quote Clint Eastwood, and he would say, a person's got to be aware of their own limitations. And I don't think I could write a good science fiction work without the assistance of someone who knew more about science than I do. I have ideas about a science fiction novel, at least a couple of them, that I've played with. And in one case, even tried starting, until I realized that my knowledge of science is just, I don't think it's enough. Good science fiction has to have good science integrated into it. And so I decided I don't think that's what I'm going to do, unless it was someone that decided that they wanted to work on it with me. I'm thinking about the possibility of a third David Gomes story. And this would be, it's not going to be I don't think that I could write a good thing about youth right now, but it's going to be complicated. It's going to, if I get off the ground, it's going to involve a level of tragedy that faces David and Pam, and the impact of this on a larger plot. But that's as much as I'm prepared to say right now. When I go on vacation, I may start trying to work on it, because the way I write fiction is that I essentially film the story in my head. I mean, that's almost what it's like. It's like I create a film, but it's in my head, working through different scenes, character development, stuff like that. Then I put together an outline. And the outline is brief. And then I start writing. I basically have this story in my head.
I don't want to stay on the topic of science fiction. I will mention we do have a science fiction reading group, which mostly, or a lot, has read books by people who were mainstream writers who decided to dip into science fiction to advance the stories, as opposed to hardcore science fiction writers.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we can let it go. Other thoughts and questions? So I'll mention something else we haven't talked about yet. A couple of people.
Mike has his hand.
Oh, Mike, go ahead. Michael. Unmute.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to thank Bill for doing this and writing the book. It just brought, for me personally, and I think that's the thing about fiction, is it allows us to engage in a different way than nonfiction and the sort of intellectual part of our brain. For me, in the mid-'70s, I was picking fruit in British Columbia, and I was working with, it happened to be a lot of Portuguese people would come in the 50s, and as workers apparently hired because they were short and could work in the trees really well without ruining the apple and pears trees. But a lot of the people I got friendly with were young Portuguese and Spanish people who were fleeing what was going on in Portugal and Spain at the time because they'd been politically involved. And so this whole thing that you're writing about, it somewhat tangential to that, but it really brought back memories of all of that I don't think I've spent much time thinking about since those years. And but going to your point about reconciliation and all of that, I guess I don't, speaking as a rehabilitated lawyer, I gave up on the idea of justice a long time ago, and to the degree that it exists in the world, I think it mostly does exist in the arts, and I think that's one of the things that we find so compelling about it, is it gives us a kind of satisfaction that we're not going to get from reality. So and it satisfies an emotional needs that we have that we're not going to get from nonfiction and what we kind of have elsewhere in our lives. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good that you could bring up this more personal stuff. So when I look at my questions, a number of them, I don't want to give away anything since a lot of people haven't read the book. So I'll ask two things in a general way and see if you can answer them, recognizing that a lot of people are just starting.
Mhm.
So one of them comes from a couple people who heard you talk, other talks you've given, and decided not to come this afternoon, but who have read the book, actually. And they were struck by the fact that you know, there are a lot of women characters in the book, and you spend time describing them physically and also their attractiveness to the male characters. And wondered how you approached that when you were talking about the editor that you worked with, and also that at the end you mentioned that your daughter helped edit it. I just wondered how you approached that. And then another question also really about the book, which is that it struck me that there's a lot of chapters in it that deal with kind of I'll just say the business of the newspaper, without going into what that was, and hardly anything about any of the other people who work there except for the front desk person and the owner and the intern person. I mean, there's a couple places where it's clear there are other people who are writers, you know, and so on. But there's no real sense of thinking of you as a labor person. There's no real sense of who worked there, what it was like to work there, how the newspaper was actually edited, physically printed, or anything. But a lot about, you know, the finance of it, the business of it, and so on. And I also wondered about that, just in terms of writing the book.
So let me deal with that first, and the first question, which I'm glad you raised. Part of it was trying to keep this book focused. There was any number of ways that I could have gone sideways with this book and gone off on interesting tangents that would have increased the length of the book. And so part of what I was trying to figure out, Steve, is how to get to the point, which you know as someone who spent years editing things that I've written. That hasn't always been easy for me. And so I was focusing on what I thought to be the most relevant issues. And basically, I think without giving everything away, part of what's going on in the book is the future of the paper. The paper's in trouble for a variety of reasons that have largely to do with things that we were starting to feel in the media world at that time. And so there's this question about what's going to happen. And so that's a subplot in this whole story. I felt like it was enough to focus on that rather than to develop other characters. Now, in terms of the first one, I'm glad you raised this because so I want to be very clear that when I wrote The Man Who Fell from the Sky, the first draft was shown to 5 people, 3 women and 2 men. And then my editor and I worked on it. after it came out, there were questions that were raised to me about it being very sexual, about the main character, you know, and his relationship with women and being interested and all that stuff. And one person said something fairly insulting to me, which was, well, you know, you should show this to women before you publish it. And I said, well, I showed it to 3, and not one of them had the same comment that you did. So why don't we think about what that means, right? But the deeper thing is that I wonder how many of the people that have raised these questions would have raised these questions had they not known me personally or known my politics. In other words, if this book was written by James Brown or James Smith, right, would they have said the same thing? That's one of the things I was wondering. Because neither book is a supplement to angles on the origin of the family, private property, and the state. The second thing, though, is that the books deal with people who are in their 20s. And I feel like I have to remind some people who maybe have forgotten how sexual we were in our 20s, and particularly around in the 1970s. And you know, there's a sex revolution and all this stuff going on, and all this kind of experimentation and everything else. And it was a highly sexual environment, which when you get past a certain age, you can sort of forget. And I wanted to remind people, you know, David Gomes, particularly in the first book, is a guy who's like in his mid to late 20s, is attractive, smart, is involved in a relationship, but has commitment issues. Both because he's not sure he wants to commit, and he's also not sure that it's fair to his girlfriend to commit. And part of it is also that there are all these opportunities out there that he is confronting. I'm not too old to remember exactly those circumstances. And so I wanted to play with that, because part of what I was getting at with Gomes has to, and in some ways this is why I wrote a sequel. Gomes has to come to grips with himself and what he wants out of life, and what it means to make a commitment. All of the issues that many of us had to deal with at the same time. So that's why I did it.
Good answer. And I wonder whether Linda, who you know, she heard that.
Yeah.
And she said it was hard to think of it knowing you.
Right.
Okay, I have one last question, which could be just a pop question.
Sure.
David Gomes or Eddie O'Hare, which one stands in for Bill Fletcher?
Oh, so
You see Michael smiling. Have you read the whole book already?
you're on mute, Michael.
I'm 20 pages short of the end.
Yeah.
If you want to go on pause, I'll finish it and come back. But,
Okay. So neither of the characters are based on me, no, I shouldn't say, neither of the characters are me. But there are definitely parts of my life and my thinking that you see in David Gomes. Eddie O'Hare is based on a guy, he's a composite of a guy I actually used to work with in the Quincy shipyard and some people I met in Northern Ireland in 1988 when I was there, who in that case were connected with the Sinn Féin. I just decided to make it more interesting to have this guy with the Irish Republican Socialist Party, since most people in the United States don't know who they were. But yeah, that's a composite. David Gomes is a non-ideological left-leaning person. He's not like a Maoist, a Trotskyist, or whatever, right? He doesn't, but he's left-leaning. And he has definitely some of me. And there's a scene that I put in where he and Pam are having an argument. And I introduced this because in a lot of ways, I'm trying to see whether I can find it. In a lot of ways, the argument speaks to issues that I had to grapple with. Hold on, I'll tell you. Let me just.
For those who haven't read the book, the second passage that Bill read, sorry, I'm a bit hoarse today. The second passage that Bill read, the guy in the bar who was shooting pool and who was very polished and dangerous was Eddie O'Hare.
Yes.
He's kind of this superhero.
Hold on one second. I'm very sorry to do this.
Actually, if this book was going to dip into science fiction, Eddie O'Hare could have had some superpowers.
Yeah. Indeed. Well, okay. I cannot seem to find it. There's a point in the book when basically Pam confronts David and says, in effect, that we have a partnership and that that she's not just going along for the ride.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah,
that was very dramatic.
It was an important piece for me, Steve, to put that in because it really was a version of something that Candace, my wife, said to me a very long time ago before we got married. When I was, in many respects, taking her for granted, loved her, but was taking her for granted. And she just called me on it. And it wasn't as dramatic as what Pam does, but it was, pretty much to the point. And it shook me up. And what I wanted to do here was to basically say to the reader the same thing. I wanted the reader to feel that that David had been shaken.
Yeah. I wonder how many political couples have had similar scenes as that. And I felt it as I read it.
I would bet that a whole lot have.
What do you mean? So we're coming to the end, and I just wonder, particularly Lisa or Jacqueline, if you have any final thoughts to share, and also Alita, you've been on. Maybe you had something you wanted to throw in, or George.
I just want to say thank you very much, Steve, for introducing me to Bill Fletcher's writings and for the opportunity, and that I think it's going to make a wonderful contribution to our summer noir section. It looks far deeper than what we've usually dealt with, like in previous summers, and I'm very excited to read this, and thank you very much.
I'd especially like to thank Jacqueline and Steve for keeping the literary aspect of MEP alive. And it's a great talk, and thank you.
I want to thank Bill, and I might be seeing you. You were one of the proposed speakers for a race and labor conference that I'm helping put together at UMass Dartmouth. So we'll maybe get to see you in person, perhaps sometime in the near future. But there's also, just to kind of circle back to something to Jacqueline's comment, and to Steve, which is, it's wonderful that we have groups that are reading literature. I haven't been able to be part of any of those, although I convened one many, many years ago, of political women's fictional writings, like back in the 1980s. But I think something that we can think about in terms of also not that it's not a worthy undertaking to have a reading group focus on literature, but to do more where we integrate both. So where we read things that are classified or categorized as history and or political theory, as well as literature kind of integrated within that study, and we kind of look at those things in relationship to each other. I know we've done that, but I'd like to see us think about ways that we can do more of that in some of our reading groups and classes. But thank you, Bill, for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen, I found that chapter,
Okay.
and I thought maybe we could end this with me reading this.
I just want to make sure I understood something Jacqueline just said, because if I did, it's something that I've thought of too, which is that, there are fiction reading groups and there are nonfiction reading groups, and I never understood why, political topics couldn't be enhanced by reading novels at the same time.
Well, you've given me
That's what you were saying.
Yeah, this is Jacqueline. You've given me food for thought. We just had I don't want to take away from Bill's time while he reads that important section, but I do want to point out that the last session of our lit group was on Iranian women writers. And the weekly discussions covered a lot of political background, and we had two participants who were Iranian and gave us tremendous discussion. So simply because a group is described as a literature group does not mean that the discussions do not include political matters. And maybe we need, a panel discussing just what we expect of literature and of groups and the opportunities within these groups. I'll have to think this over. But once again, I have to thank the MEP for giving me something to think about bigger than my work week. So I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to Bill's concluding remarks.
Take us out, Bill.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. So this is chapter 53, and it takes place after a very dramatic incident has unfolded, which I'm not going to tell you about. And David goes home. Pam was in the living room laying on the couch with the television on, but not paying it much attention. When David walked into the house, he expected she was going to grab him, but instead she remained on the couch saying nothing. Hi, babe. Aunt Flora told me that she called you. After I left the police station, I spent some time with her. Glad you were able to find the time to get home. Have you eaten anything? Gomes felt as if he had just been slapped. He walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed 2 beers. He walked back into the living room, placed the beer next to Pam, and sat down. He took a long sip of his beer and looked over at Pam, who had not touched hers. I'm not sure where to start. After the incident, I was taken to the police headquarters and interrogated. Then I went to meet with Aunt Flora. We discussed the whole situation. On the way home, I called Hank through a secure arrangement that we put together some time ago in case of emergencies. Getting no response, he added, I'm sorry I couldn't call you earlier. I needed to find out what was going on and who was trying to kill me. Things played out more dangerously than I had expected. Pam sat quietly. She did not open the beer, just fingered it as if she was going to peel it apart. She looked at Gomes with the most serious gaze he had ever seen, leaving him feeling as if a laser had been fired at his eyes. He could almost feel the pain. More dangerously than you expected? This morning, Mr. David Smartass Gomes, you left the house as if it was just any other day. You told me that you were doing this interview and that you needed to push this Alice love. But you didn't tell me that you were putting your life on the line. In fact, I had asked you whether the story is worth your life. You obviously knew this was going to be dangerous because you arranged for some backup. Pam, I don't know. David, stop right there. Just stop right the hell there. Her voice was loud and shrill. She held her right hand up with the palm pointed at Gomes. Don't play me for a fool, David. Don't tell me that you don't know who the gunman was who saved your damn life. Please, don't treat me like an idiot. I'm not going to ask you who it was, but you clearly knew the person. You can tell others until the cows come home that you don't know who that person was, but don't lay that shit on me. Gomes sat back in the chair, feeling like he had taken a shotgun blast in his chest. Looking at Pam, he took another long drink of his beer. David, I thought that you and I had an understanding. Maybe your brain has gotten foggy, so let me clarify what we agreed to. You and I are a partnership. I did not come along for the ride. I'm not your assistant or muse. I'm not someone to be entertained and protected as if I'm a baby in a carriage. I'm your wife and partner. We're in this together. I'm not someone to be sheltered. Got it? Before Gomes could open his mouth, she went on. If you thought that we signed up for some sort of other relationship, let's put that on the table right now and figure out what to do. I expect honesty. I expect directness. I expect collaboration. An attack on you is an attack on us, and I'm not simply collateral damage. Got it? So, Mr. David Gomes, the love of my life and partner in crime, you and I are going to take a deep breath, and we're going to start this entire damn story over from the very beginning. We are going to discuss how you ended up in a shootout at the OK Corral, and we're going to discuss what we need to do. I'm sure that Hank has some serious suggestions, and we're going to factor all that into our next steps. Got it? Or do I have to draw you pictures? Pam grabbed the beer, opened it with force, and took a deep drink. She slowly sat back on the couch, looking deep into her husband's eyes. I got it, he said, his voice low, eyes looking at the floor to break from her gaze. All right, then. The best way to do this is to explain why I went to New Bedford on this trip and what I discovered. Pamela took another drink of beer and seemed to relax slightly. Well, maybe we should start with the visit I had from Cunha. The plot thickened with what he revealed. Turns out.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you.
That's and a good place to stop. Thank you so much for doing this, Bill.
Pleasure.
I realize, as probably everybody here, a number of people probably registered so they could watch the recording. So more people will see this. But I appreciate everybody who was here, the great comments and questions, and thank you all for a good afternoon.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.